For more than 3 decades, Eustace Conway has lived the way most Americans only dream about. Off the land, away from the noise, completely self-reliant. His Turtle Island Preserve in North Carolina became a symbol of freedom, wilderness education, and traditional craftsmanship. But as his popularity grew through mountain men and public tours, so did the attention of state officials. What followed was a quiet government pressure campaign, surprise inspections, accusations of code violations, and a legal fight that nearly erased everything he built by hand. Today, we're uncovering the real reason officials tried to shut him down, and why some people believe his lifestyle threatens more than just regulation. Subscribe for more wilderness stories and forgotten truths. Long before television cameras followed him through the woods, Eustace Conway was already living the life most Americans only romanticize. Born in 1961 in Columbia, South Carolina, he was raised in a household that treated the outdoors not as recreation, but as a proving ground. His father, a stern engineer with uncompromising expectations, believed hardship forged character. From a young age, Eustace slept outside in handmade shelters, wore buckskins instead of store-bought jackets, and learned to eat whatever the land provided. Where most children feared the dark, Eustace was taught to read shadows, track movement, and find comfort in silence. By age 12, he could identify dozens of trees by bark alone. At 14, he killed his first deer with a homemade bow. He began tanning hides, stitching moccasins, and experimenting with primitive shelter designs. He kept journals full of sketches, spear tips, smoke-drying racks, and log cabin notching techniques. His father never praised him. Instead, he pushed harder. Challenge, suffer, improve. Those 3 ideas became the silent pillars of Eustace's identity. School felt like a cage. Indoors, fluorescent lights hummed, and the world outside was alive. While classmates memorized multiplication tables, he studied edible weeds, medicinal roots, and the flight patterns of migrating birds. Teachers described him as capable but distracted, his eyes always drifting toward the window. He wasn't defiant. He simply belonged somewhere else. By his late teens, his skills were far beyond hobbyist curiosity. He traveled thousands of miles on horseback, paddled rivers for weeks at a time, and lived off the land with near monastic discipline. Friends called it obsession. To Eustace, it was preparation, sharpening instincts dulled by modern convenience. He saw a world growing softer, slower, addicted to comfort. He feared people were losing something ancient and necessary. His father's strict upbringing also forged a deeper rebellion. If authority meant confinement, then freedom required distance. When other teenagers chased cars, concerts, and parties, Eustace chased solitude, because the woods never judged, never demanded, never lied. By the time he reached adulthood, he was certain of one thing: the skills humanity needed most were the ones civilization was deliberately forgetting. And if he didn't protect them, no one would. Those early years weren't about adventure, they were the blueprint for a life built completely outside the grid. A life that would eventually challenge county officials, zoning boards, and the very definition of freedom itself. By the early 1980s, Eustace had traveled more wilderness miles than most park rangers log in a career. But constant movement eventually sharpened a new realization. Adventure teaches you. A village teaches others. If the next generation never learned primitive skills, the knowledge would die with him. So he searched the Appalachian foothills for land, walking ridge to ridge, reading the lay of the mountains the way others read books. He wanted mixed hardwood forest, natural springs, and enough slope to avoid developers. Eventually, he found a hidden pocket of Boone, North Carolina. Steep, quiet, sheltered, untouched. It felt like a secret the earth wanted to keep. In 1987, he purchased his first tract. With no contractors and no blueprints, he raised structures from hand-hewn logs, notched beams, and stone pulled from nearby creek beds. Every shed, bunkhouse, cook shelter, and tool shop carried fingerprints instead of serial codes. Word spread quietly. Scouts visited first, then hikers, then school groups. Children learned to scrape hides, start friction fires, identify deer beds, and cook with cast iron under open sky. Parents watched their children transform, not into campers, but into capable young adults. Over time, Eustace acquired more land, eventually expanding Turtle Island to more than 1,000 acres. He never advertised it as a tourist attraction. It was a living classroom. Students learned horsemanship, metal forging, water purification, and the art of using less. He believed struggle built confidence, and the preserve became his proof. Those who visited didn't forget the smell of wood smoke, the sting of cold creek water, or the soreness earned from real work. But growth created friction. More vehicles appeared on gravel roads. Smoke curled above the tree line from outdoor ovens and fire pits. Laughter echoed through hollows where silence once ruled. Neighbors had mixed reactions. Some were fascinated. Others worried about noise, fire risk, and outsiders wandering private landlines. One neighbor complained repeatedly about smoke blowing through windows. Another disliked busloads of students on narrow roads. Still, Turtle Island remained peaceful, its culture built on respect, instruction, and grit. Visitors left with dirt under their fingernails and a confidence they didn't know they had. Yet behind the scenes, county zoning boards noticed the preserve's increasing activity. Schools require compliance. Camps require inspection. Businesses require permits. Turtle Island was none of these things, and all of them at once. For nearly 20 years, it operated quietly, like a frontier village hidden in plain sight. But as television publicity grew and the public flooded toward rustic authenticity, the preserve crossed an invisible threshold. It became visible to bureaucracy, and bureaucracy does not ignore what it can regulate. Eustace didn't know it yet, but Turtle Island's greatest test was coming, not from predators, fire, or harsh winters, but from paperwork thicker than any log wall he'd ever built. For years, Turtle Island Preserve operated quietly, attracting small groups of students, scouts, and curious visitors. But as its reputation grew, so did activity on the narrow roads leading to Eustace's land. More cars appeared on weekends, more smoke rose from outdoor ovens, and more voices echoed across the valley. Neighbors who once shrugged at the primitive village began calling county offices with concerns: traffic, noise, smoke drift, and visitors wandering too close to private property lines. At first, officials treated these complaints as minor, but paperwork has a way of stacking, and soon different departments began reviewing the preserve. When regulators examined photos from field trips and workshops, they realized Turtle Island didn't fit neatly into any legal category. It wasn't a campground, not exactly a school, not fully a business, and not a residential development. That ambiguity made inspectors uneasy. County planners scheduled on-site visits. What they found wasn't negligence, but a clash of worlds. Sleeping lofts lacked the required window sizes. Hand-built stairs didn't meet prescribed railing height. Fire pits were placed near structures without the separation distance listed in code books. The buildings were sturdy, but they had no stamped lumber or modern fire-rated panels. To Eustace, these cabins were safe because he built them with the same techniques used for centuries. To inspectors, they lacked paperwork, and paperwork proves safety on paper. Health department officials noticed communal meals cooked in outdoor kitchens, served to large groups. That triggered food service rules. Educational groups sleeping in rustic bunkhouses triggered lodging regulations. Even the composting toilets, praised by environmentalists, triggered sanitation reviews. Meanwhile, neighbors continued reporting concerns. One complained that wood smoke drifted into her home through open window. Another worried about emergency vehicle access if something went wrong. Each call became documentation. Once there are enough entries in a file, enforcement becomes mandatory. Eustace believed common sense governed the wilderness. Thick logs resist fire better than drywall. Spring water is safe if filtered through stone. But modern codes were built for suburbs, not frontier replicas. Turtle Island wasn't failing inspections out of danger. It was failing because it didn't speak the language of regulations. By the end of the year, Officials decided the preserve needed full compliance or closure. What had begun as calls from frustrated neighbors had quietly turned Turtle Island into a legal target. And for the first time, Eustace realized the biggest threat to living off the land wasn't the wilderness, it was the rulebook. In late 2012, after months of growing complaints, county officials arrived at Turtle Island without warning. They walked the grounds with clipboards, measuring tapes, and cameras. Eustace cooperated, confident that his buildings were solid. But inspectors didn't evaluate craftsmanship, they evaluated compliance. Hand-hewn beams lacked the grading stamps required by commercial lumber. Sleeping lofts were accessed by ladders, not code-approved stairways. Fire pits were too close to structures. Cabins had no sprinkler systems, no smoke alarms, and no emergency lighting. Even outdoor kitchens required health department licensing. Officials returned to the county office and compiled a formal violation list. Days later, an order arrived. Educational programs must stop immediately until every building met modern standards. Overnight, Turtle Island's workshops, camps, and school visits halted. Parents were confused. Volunteers were stunned. To Eustace, it felt like someone had poured concrete over a flowing stream, his life's work frozen by paperwork. When news spread, officials insisted the crackdown was about safety, not lifestyle. They argued that any place hosting children and students must meet state code. No exceptions. But supporters saw a bigger problem. Building codes were written for suburban houses with drywall, stamped lumber, PVC pipes, and approved insulation. Turtle Island's cabins were built from logs thicker than any code-approved stud. Yet because they lacked factory stamps, they were considered unsafe on paper. Inspectors demanded steel connectors, pressure-treated stair rails, and commercial plumbing, none of which matched 1800 construction. Eustace argued that forcing modern materials would destroy the authenticity of his educational mission. Lawyers warned that compliance costs could exceed hundreds of thousands of dollars. Meanwhile, some neighbors quietly pushed for enforcement, hoping the preserve would shrink or close. For the first time, Eustace saw the unspoken conflict. Tradition and self-reliance were colliding head-on with a regulatory system built for convenience and liability protection. He wrote in his journal, "The wilderness rewards effort. The county rewards paperwork." The battle was no longer over logs or ladders. It was over whether an old way of living had a legal right to exist. When officials ordered Turtle Island to shut down, the reaction was immediate. Local newspapers picked up the story, highlighting how a primitive skills preserve had been stopped by modern building codes. Former students rushed online to defend Eustace, sharing how the preserve taught them responsibility, teamwork, and resilience. Parents argued that the cabins, though rustic, were safer than many summer camps they'd visited. Social media amplified everything, painting the shutdown as an attack on traditional living. Support grew quickly. Petitions collected thousands of signatures within days. Supporters insisted that codes written for suburban homes shouldn't apply to log structures modeled after 1800s techniques. They pointed out that thick wood walls resist fire better than treated lumber, and that spring water systems had worked long before chlorination. To these voices, Turtle Island wasn't unsafe. It was simply unconventional. However, critics surfaced too. Some neighbors complained about increased traffic on narrow gravel roads, smoke drifting from open-fire kitchens, and concerns about emergency access if something went wrong. Environmental groups worried about wastewater seepage, questioning whether composting toilets were being managed properly. To regulators, every complaint added weight. Once documented, they couldn't be ignored. Television reporters arrived, eager to explore the clash between old-world craftsmanship and modern regulation. Interviews with Eustace aired, showing him calm, articulate, and committed to teaching self-reliance. Officials responded by emphasizing liability. If someone were injured on site, tax dollars might be responsible. Insurance companies refused coverage without code compliance, placing even more pressure on the county to act. Local politicians began receiving emails from frustrated citizens. Some argued the government was smothering tradition. Others insisted safety should never be compromised, no matter how noble the mission. The debate quickly shifted from logs and ladders to culture itself. Could history be taught authentically under modern law? County officials proposed expensive upgrades: sprinklers, graded lumber, wider exits, commercial kitchens. But these changes would erase the primitive environment entirely. To supporters, this wasn't safety, it was sterilization. Quietly, lawmakers in Raleigh began drafting a bill to address the conflict. They realized Turtle Island represented a fading piece of American heritage. If regulations couldn't bend even slightly, entire lifestyles could vanish. Eustace documented everything, writing, "If you regulate the wild long enough, it stops being wild at all." He wouldn't give up, not because he wanted to win, but because he believed future generations needed the freedom to learn from the land directly, without permission slips. As pressure mounted, county officials escalated the case into formal hearings. Courtrooms replaced forests, and lawyers replaced axes and carving knives. Eustace entered the legal arena at a disadvantage. Primitive living simply wasn't accounted for in modern statutes. The county's attorney argued that any facility hosting overnight guests must abide by statewide building and fire codes. They pointed to printed pages listing stair widths, emergency exits, sprinkler requirements, and graded lumber rules. All regulations Turtle Island failed to meet. Eustace's attorney countered by emphasizing context. Turtle Island wasn't a rental lodge, a tourist resort, or a commercial summer camp. It was an educational preserve dedicated to teaching pre-industrial skills. For students to learn authentically, the environment itself had to be authentic, but the judge could only interpret the law as written. The codebook made no distinction between a hand-built cabin meant to demonstrate frontier design and a modern short-term lodging unit. If people slept inside a structure, the same rules applied. Witnesses testified on both sides. Former students spoke about leadership development, teamwork, and the confidence earned through hard work. Parents praised the preserve's emphasis on discipline and respect. When firefighters took the stand, they were sympathetic but firm. They warned that response times to remote structures were slow and that building features like sprinklers could buy critical minutes in an emergency. Meanwhile, insurance auditors submitted reports stating liability concern. Without compliance, they argued, accidents would be legally volatile. The courtroom felt less like a discussion about safety and more like a clash between eras. One side spoke the language of lumber stamps and UL fire ratings. The other spoke in tradition, craftsmanship, and centuries-old methods that predated the codebook entirely. After multiple hearings, the tone shifted. Judges suggested phased upgrades or partial closures, compromises that still required expensive retrofits. But each proposed fix chipped away at the identity of Turtle Island. Drywall over log walls, factory lumber replacing hand-hewn beams, chemical-treated materials replacing natural ones. The legal message became clear. The law wasn't built to accommodate lifestyles older than itself. When the final hearing adjourned for deliberation, Eustace left quietly, brushing sawdust from his sleeve. He wrote later, "A courtroom cannot measure the strength of a log cabin, only the thickness of paperwork behind it." The wild was no longer his toughest opponent. Words, pages, and legal categories were. Just when it seemed Turtle Island would be forced to modernize or close entirely, something unexpected happened. The public outcry caught the attention of state lawmakers who recognized the cultural and educational value at stake. Meetings were arranged in Raleigh, where Eustace calmly explained the importance of preserving primitive construction techniques. Legislators agreed the current codebook had no category for a place like his. The result was House Bill 774, a law granting exemptions for primitive camps and traditional education preserves. Turtle Island would need basic safety measures, but the hand-built cabins could stand as they were. It was a rare moment where policy bent to protect heritage instead of erasing it. When the bill passed, supporters celebrated. For the first time, the law acknowledged that not all safety is measured by modern standards. Turtle Island reopened quietly, fire pits crackling again beneath the trees. But victory came with a realization. Survival in the modern world requires more than skill with an axe. It requires patience with paperwork. Turtle Island may have one breathing room, but the struggle didn't vanish. Even after the bill passed, regulations continued to evolve around insurance, liability waivers, environmental impact, and emergency access. Every year brought new forms, updated codes, and compliance reviews. Eustace spent more time in front of computers and county boards than he ever imagined. He often joked that the only thing harder than surviving winter in the wilderness was surviving government paperwork in the spring. Behind the scenes, costs rose. Insurance demanded higher premiums. Property taxes reflected growing land value, not the primitive cabins sitting on it. Liability concerns multiplied in a culture increasingly driven by litigation. And as the preserve gained fame through mountain men, more visitors wanted to stay overnight, increasing scrutiny. A single twisted ankle could trigger reports. A smoky wind shift could spark new neighbor complaints. The pressure never fully faded. Yet Eustace refused to let frustration sour his mission. He continued teaching friction fires, hide tanning, timber framing, and what he called the forgotten fundamentals. He explained that these skills weren't romantic hobbies. They were survival knowledge humanity might one day rely on again. Students listened, hands blistered, hearts opened. They learned that comfort dulls instinct and struggle sharpens character. Still, the looming question persisted. How long can ancient living coexist with modern oversight? Turtle Island occupies a complicated legal space, too primitive for modern standards, but too educational to ignore. The solution, Eustace knew, wasn't rebellion, it was endurance. As he aged, new challenges emerged. Injuries healed slower. Maintenance demanded younger hands. He worried about succession. Who would take over when he no longer could? Wilderness skills can be taught, but stewardship requires vision and stubbornness. Turtle Island's future depends on finding people willing to shoulder both. Today, the preserve stands stronger because of the battle, not in spite of it. Visitors still arrive, wide-eyed, touching rough beams carved by hand. Children leave with confidence and calloused palms. Parents thank him for reminding their families that life doesn't need Wi-Fi to feel real. But Eustace keeps a quiet awareness. One shift in policy, one insurance requirement, one zoning change, and decades of preservation could be threatened again. The fight isn't over. It simply moves slower now, like a creek carving rock grain by grain. In his journal, he wrote, "Freedom is not the absence of rules. It's the willingness to keep living your truth when the rules tighten. And as long as fires burn beneath Turtle Island's stars, the old ways endure. Not because the law allows them, but because a stubborn woodsman never stopped defending the right to know how to survive."